Global heating is threatening industries that have partly created it. Scientists say the climate crisis is endangering both biodiversity as well as the survival of industrialized societies.
In a sea of competing voices, science must be our common language. And what the science is telling us is very, very clear. We are facing a climate emergency, and we are approaching a series of tipping points. We must act urgently.
Officials at the UN Climate Summit are scrambling to implement the pledges they made under the 2015 Paris deal. With both mounting scientific evidence and rising pressure from activists, new regulations are expected to accelerate in coming years. While that's what many have long been calling for, financiers have other worries.
As the realities of climate change catch up, social pressure mounts and low-carbon solutions get cheaper, it's highly improbable that governments will be allowed to let the world sleepwalk into greater rises in temperature without being compelled into forceful action sooner. This poses huge threats for assets and for the wider system.
UN-backed group Principles of Responsible Investing projects tighter government laws could erase up to $2.3 trillion of value of companies within the next 5 years, ranging from agriculture to automotive industries. The fossil fuel sector is likely to be hit the hardest. It could lose 1/3 of its value as fossil fuels account for around 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Coal companies could lose as much as 44%, while oil and gas firms could be deprived of nearly 1/3 of their value. Environmentalists have accused some of these companies of greenwashing, saying they're trying to influence the climate talks by paying millions in sponsorship and sending more lobbyists to Madrid than the entire European Union delegation itself. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, by 2050 the climate crisis will cost the global economy $8 trillion. And as climate conditions that are endangering both nature and human health worsen, losing out on shorter-term polluting dollars could be a bearable price to pay. Sibel Karkus, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, Sven Harmeling joins us now from Madrid. He's the Global Policy Lead on Climate Change at CARE International. Welcome back to the program, Sven. Now, before we get into the findings of this PRI report, can I begin by asking you about COP25 more generally? What's the feeling there right now? Is it one of optimism or pessimism in terms of how far countries have to go to address the climate crisis?
Well, I think there's always two perspectives on such a conference. I mean, on the one hand, there are specific political deliverables that are on the agenda here. Some of them matter to carbon markets, for example. It's also about addressing the impact of the climate crisis in developing countries. And I think the negotiations are now coming into the final straight, so to say. Ministers are arriving and need to pick up some of the pieces that the technical level negotiators haven't solved. But I think, unfortunately, we are looking at a scenario where even with some relatively okay outcomes, so to say, by the end of this week, this is by far insufficient to really address the climate emergency that your program already talked about.
Yes, and we know that many people are still reeling from the Trump administration's decision to pull out of that groundbreaking Paris Agreement, which committed countries to cut carbon emissions. Is that move by one of the world's biggest polluters casting a shadow over proceedings in Madrid right now?
Well, I would say it's not the main thing people talk about here. On the one hand, it was expected over the last years, but also because there are many forces in the US who are just ignoring the decision from the Trump administration. There have been House representatives here, there are a lot of business here, and they basically saying we are still in the US. There are many actors in the US which are committed. So I think that's also positive news. But I think overall, we're just seeing that the national plans for many governments, in particular the bigger countries, are by far not adding up, and much more needs to be done to shift away from fossil fuels, for example.
Okay, well, let's look at this report now by the Principles of Responsible Investing group. It says carbon-intensive firms like oil and other fossil fuel companies could lose up to 43% of their value as global measures to fight the climate crisis intensify. Now, are you worried about the impact that might have on the workers in those industries, many of whom do come from poorer countries?
Well, I think the first worry is about the planetary emergency dimensions we're talking about. And science is so clear and there's so many findings that if we don't really shift course, the impacts globally and in many poor countries will be extremely severe. And so I think that's the first starting point. The second is, of course, there's a lot of, let's say, values in certain parts of the economy at risk. But climate action hasn't come overnight. I mean, we're seeing the impacts for many years, and it has been building up, and every responsible business, I would say, could have seen this coming. So I think the main point is, on the one hand, how do we invest much more into the cleaner energy sources, for example, into protection of forests, and how, of course, do we also support those workers who basically are with companies whose value has to go down, or all these companies shift their business models to cleaner solutions. But I think the positive thing is that under the label of just transition, there's a lot of discussions going on, even here in the talks in Madrid, and there are many more forces who say we need to do climate action, we need to do it in a just way, of course, but we cannot let the climate action be stopped by just being concerned about the value of big fossil fuel companies.
And just very briefly before we let you go, Sven, we know the teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg is there at COP25. She's managed to rally hundreds of thousands of school children around the world calling for urgent action on the climate crisis. But do you think the business community will listen to her as well?
Well, my experience is that many more stakeholders and decision makers in the business community have started to listen and have started to take action. There are, for example, insurance companies who have just started to say, well, we will stop insuring coal power plants because it's just not responsible business. And some of them are also seeing the dramatic costs increasing with climate change. But I think overall it's clear that we need many more strong voices, and we need the politics to change, and this is really important in the next year, that all governments, in particular the big countries, really enhance the ambition of their national climate plans, and then by the end of the year or earlier, bring back these new plans to the table here.
Okay, Sven Harmeling from CARE International, good to get your thoughts as always, and best of luck for the rest of the summit there.